So just to give you a little bit of background about why we organized this workshop. It's a workshop that is organized under the umbrella of two Horizon 2020 projects that are funded, in which the Center for Diversity Policy Research and Practice is participating. So one is Resistere and one is UNICEF. The Resistere project, Resistere stands for Responding to Outbreaks Through Co-Creative Inclusive Equality Strategies. And it's a project where we aim to analyze the impact of COVID-19 policies on gender plus inequalities. So the research that we have been conducting all together as a consortium in the Resistere project shows that sexism, harassment, and bullying has taken new forms during the pandemic, including in particular digital violence. And during this time, it became clear that there has been an increase in gender-based violence. But the lack of systematic data collection has really prevented anybody from analyzing the problem in any depth, and therefore to design measures to combat violence in the first place. The great thing that happened, however, as a result of the pandemic in relation to gender-based violence is that it brought a lot more attention to the problem of gender-based violence generally. And then it allowed to mobilize actors to start responding and combating. That could be devising policies and measures just at different levels, at national level, but also at organizational level. So we've seen the pandemic in particular showed us the importance of mechanisms such as the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention. We also think that it might have accelerated the development of the proposed EU directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence. Unfortunately, the framing of gender-based violence remains largely about the private sphere. We see this, for example, in terms of internet partner violence. And we see that gender-based violence is largely focused on looking at this in terms of how it's happening there, to the detriment of how gender-based violence could be happening in an organizational context and in the world of work. So, for example, just today, as I was preparing for this is the headline from the UK's BBC News. Okay, so they're just like looking at the true cost of our tea. If you know anything about the British, you know that they take their tea very seriously. And they're looking at what is happening on the tea farms where tea is being grown and produced, and talking about the organizational aspect of sexual abuse that is taking place. So this is really very much about the organizational context of gender-based violence. And this happens to be in Kenya, in Africa, but certainly Europe is just riddled with gender-based violence in the workplace as well. So developments such as the ILO Convention 190 on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work, and the associated campaigns that we've seen and events linked to that are likely to generate better understandings and therefore responses to gender-based violence in the world of work. But we still suffer from a lack of large-scale evidence of the problem and we need that evidence to support any efforts, including at European level. So an exception of this is, for example, the work of Eurofound using the European Working Condition Telephone Survey, which we will hear about today. Another source of evidence is, of course, the UNICEF project, which is the second project under which we're organizing this event. And this is a project where we aim to produce better knowledge on gender-based violence and sexual harassment. And we do this within the context of universities and other research performing organizations. Our aim is to translate this knowledge into operational tools for higher education, research organizations, and policymakers. So although the focus of the UNICEF project is about academic and research institutions, we think that it's very likely that our greater understandings of prevalence, consequences, and the effectiveness of measures and policies within the context is going to be of relevance to wider organizations. And what both projects show is the scale of the problem of gender-based violence in the world of work, but also the conflation of gender-based violence with violence against women, which is extremely problematic, particularly since members of LGBT communities are those that are most likely to experience gender-based violence. So today we will hear both from Dr. Viginta Ivaškaitė-Tamošiūnė and Sofia Strid. So it's just really my pleasure to start by introducing Viginta. Viginta is a research officer in the Working Life Unit at Eurofound, which is based in Ireland, but is an EU agency. There she's involved in projects investigating working conditions in Europe, based on the European Working Conditions Survey. And more specifically, she focuses on paid and unpaid working time, well-being, gender segregation, adverse social behavior at work, psychosocial risks, minimum wages. Before joining Eurofound in 2022, she worked as an economic analyst at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission and carried out cross-country research to support fiscal policy development in the EU. She also worked as a researcher at the European Institute for Gender Equality, the Lithuanian Social Research Centre, and as a lecturer at Vilnius University in Lithuania. Her other research interests include income inequality, poverty, gender equality, as well as fiscal and social policy. Viginta holds an MA in social policy and a PhD in social sciences, particularly sociology from Vilnius University. And she has been a visiting researcher at the University of Antwerp, Stockholm University, and the University of Essex. So Viginta, thank you so much today for joining us, and I'll give you the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm really happy to have this opportunity to present some of the data, some of the findings that we produced and we gathered from our European Working Conditions Survey. So let me quickly go to the European Working Conditions Telephone Survey itself, just what it is. So it's a survey that runs from 1990s. We had the 7th wave of it. And in 2021, from February to November, we collected more than 70,000 interviews in 36 countries. So we have to have the context in mind because it's still, the COVID was still there and so many countries still were facing many restrictions. So it wasn't that open as before. And initially, this survey was supposed to take part in 2020, and they started, but the COVID had interrupted our plans. So we did this interview. We had to change the mode of the interview from face-to-face to telephone. And of course, it had some implications, such as we had to cut several questions, or some questions were asked only for several respondents. But in principle, it's a high probability, high quality probability-based survey, which provides robust results and is representative for the whole working population in Europe. And in this presentation, I won't focus on all 36 countries, but only the EU. And in our questionnaire, we have 3 questions that directly relates to exposure to adverse social behavior. We ask our respondents, over the last month, during the course of your work, have you been subject to verbal abuse or threats? Over the last month, during the course of your work, have you been subject to unwanted sexual attention? And the third one, over the past 12 months, during the course of your work, have you been subject to bullying, harassment, and violence? These questions are part of the modular structure. So basically, they were asked of 2/3 of our respondents. So what do we see from the data? Probably as expected. More women than men are exposed to adverse social behavior. And probably I should show all of them. So among the working population, 12.5% of workers reported that they were exposed to some form of adverse social behavior, any of those three. And it was, of course, higher for women. It's 15% than for men. For them, it was 11%. Same for the verbal abuse of threats, which is the most frequent form of violence at work. So yet again, it was 8% for women and 10% for men. Bullying, harassment, and violence, nearly 6% of workers said that they were exposed to it. And unwanted sexual attention, you see the difference, of course, it's higher. So it was around 1% for men and 3% for women. What I don't have here, but we also have people who define them as non-binary. And they represent 0.3% of the workers. So of course, any breakdown becomes a bit complicated because the number of observations is really small. However, what we see, the levels to exposure to adverse social behavior are much higher for them, not much higher, but compared to women, it's 2 percentage points higher. So they are exposed to more adverse social behavior and especially unwanted sexual behavior, which is quite a problem for many of them. But for the rest of my presentation, I will only focus on women and men as the biggest gender groups answer to our questionnaire. What is also interesting to look at the age of workers, and of course we see some differences there. For example, if we look at verbal abuse or threats, so we see it's mainly younger women, 16, 24 years old women who are mostly report that they were exposed to verbal abuse or threats, and the share of people exposed to this type of violence decrease with age. If we look at the bullying, harassment, and violence, it remains rather stable, and the gap between women and men, yet again, is more or less similar throughout the years. But when we look at the unwanted sexual attention, it is specifically younger women who are experiencing it. The bigger share of young women, like 8% of 16, 24-year-olds were exposed to unwanted sexual behavior, and 4% of 25, 34-year-old women. For men of the same age groups, the shares were 2% and 1%. So it's really, the gap is pretty big. Of course, when we talk about adverse social behavior, it's one of the things that it's interesting to look whether it happens at the workplace as such, whether it's coming from co-workers, maybe managers, or third parties. Explicitly, we don't ask this in our questionnaire. The only way around is to look at whether people do have to work with external parties, whether they are customers, whether they are pupils, the patients. So when we look at whether people have any interaction, workers have any interactions with third parties, we see that the share of people reporting adverse social behavior increases, doubles. For unwanted sexual attention, the share increases 4 times. But it not only matters whether people do work with the third parties or they don't, it is the frequency, how frequently they interact with customers, pupils, or patients. So if they do it rarely or sometimes, So the share of people reporting adverse social behavior increases by 20–30% compared to the ones who don't experience adverse social behavior. But if they have to interact always or often, then we see that it really doubles compared to people who never or who rarely interact with third parties. And just to give the magnitude of how many people, what is the share of people who have to interact with customers or patients. So it's 80% of workforce have to interact at some level, at some frequency with third parties, and more than half of the working population do it frequently, like always or often. So we're talking about really huge share of people who have to work with external people. When we look to specific occupations, we see that it's mainly so-called the frontline workers that were exposed to verbal abuse or threats. So it's mainly protective service workers. It includes firefighters, police people, all protective services. And then the next two groups are health associate or health professionals. So as well as refuse workers or personal care workers. So the levels of verbal abuse or the shares of people in those occupations that were experiencing adverse social behavior were particularly high. And what is probably worrying, if we look at the occupations, health-related occupations, the unwanted sexual attention was really, really high, sometimes 3 times higher than the EU average. And just for comparison, we have INC people who where the levels of adverse social behavior is really, really comparatively low. So at the same time, they don't have that much interaction with the third parties. But of course, it's not only about third parties. Violence does happen at work and against colleagues, co-workers and managers. Another interesting result is of course, our way of work changed. Some of us had to go to work anyway, every day, like the front line workers. Some of us could work from home. And of course, it matters when we look at the adverse social behavior or exposure to adverse social behavior. And probably it's interesting to compare those who work explicitly at home, this part, and who work at employers' premises. So 7% on average, people who work from home were exposed to adverse social behavior. However, when they had to go to employment's premises or work from client's place, from vehicle, so the share of workers reporting adverse social behavior doubled. But then even if we're looking at those who work from home, the 5% of men reported that they are exposed to some type of adverse social behavior, while for women it was 9%, so nearly double. So for women it wasn't so safe place, even working from home, as for men. Being exposed to adverse social behavior has many negative health outcomes that can linger throughout your, many years ahead. So, and we really see that people who are exposed to some type of adverse social behavior always report higher levels of negative health outcomes. And just a few indicators that we have. So the number of people who are exposed to some form of adverse social behavior report higher levels of headaches. They think that their health and safety is at risk. They report anxiety more often, especially emotional exhaustion. If you look at this, it's more than 2 times more people who were exposed to adverse social behavior had reported emotional exhaustion, or they complain that they never really have, the biggest share of them complain that they never really have energy. So we see clearly the consequences when we do a simple breakdown by those who experience social behavior, adverse social behavior at work or not. Then, of course, violence doesn't happen in vacuum. It's not only interpersonal thing, no, it's all about the workplace and the quality of work. It relates to your job resources or job demands at the same time. So everything is interlinked. And when we look at some of the indicators that we have on job demands and resources, and again, we see similar picture. So people who were exposed to some form of adverse social behavior say that they always often have to work at high speed, they have to work at tight deadlines, they have to work at night. What is especially worrying is lack of social support. So one of the resources that we get at work, so support from our colleagues and managers. And here we see that the difference is quite striking. And in this case, I don't have in the graph, but it's more men than women said that they never or rarely receive support either from colleagues or the managers. And especially if we look at this part where, of course, we expect if something happens at workplace, so it's the first connection point, no? The first person where we would go and talk is our managers. And indeed, we see that 1/3 of people who were exposed to adverse social behavior never or rarely received support. For men, it was 39%, for women, 29%. Again, so it's more for men than for women. Here are only a few variables, few indicators that we have. And actually, it's part of the bigger job quality indicator that we have constructed. And also, so is adverse social behavior at work. So it's part of the indicator. I won't present it now, but of course, the better quality the jobs are, the less adverse behavior there is, the more social support there are. But that you can read in our report. So working conditions in the time of COVID, implications for the future. The graph that I presented you today, you can find in another working paper, which is linked to the main report. And well, if you're interested in Eurofound's work and what we're producing, because there will be upcoming report also on psychosocial risks, where we also look at adverse social behavior, mental health in principle. So please check out our websites for that. Thank you so much. And I expect, if any questions, I expect them to find in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Viginta. Of course, I'm a statistician, so of course, when I see those graphs and figures, it's always exciting to see this. But what is absolutely striking here is to see the difference that we see in terms of experiences of violence. And Sofia can just help us decide just to which extent and under which conditions they are gender-based, and how that relates to the lack of support for managers. So it's just really, for me, a key takeaway in this first presentation, is because I really think it speaks to the theme of this webinar, and just thinking about what we know and what we want to do to combat gender-based violence in the world of work. So please feel free to leave some questions in the chat later. We will have some time for a Q&A, which will not be recorded. But in the meantime, I would like to take this opportunity to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Sofia Strid. So Sofia is an associate professor in gender studies at the University of Gothenburg. And since April 22, she has been there, but she was previously in the University of Orebro. Her research interests are oriented towards the social and political sciences and can be summarized as feminist and social theory, politics and policy, mobilization, activism and opposition, gendered and intersectional perspectives on sustainability, feminist violence studies in online and offline contexts. So another busy person. She applies both qualitative and quantitative methods. She directs the Center for Violence Studies together with Susan Strand, Associate Professor in Criminology, and leads the research group for Feminist Violence Studies. Sofia's research has been funded by the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Institute for Gender Equality, the Swedish Research Council, and Forte. Thank you, Sofia, for being here with us, and the mic is all yours.
All right. Am I heard? Am I seen? Am I heard? Do I exist? Thank you very much for the introduction, Anne, and thank you for inviting me to be here. And thank you so much for the previous presentations. There's so much that resonates with what we see in Resiste in particular, in what you've been saying. And I can see these numbers, how we want to take the results from Resiste and start explaining them. But I'm not going to do that today because I wasn't exactly aware of what you were going to say. But if I'd known, I could have offered some interesting input, I think. But we can talk maybe afterwards. Let's see if I can get this to work. So I will talk about gender-based violence, drawing on lessons and research from predominantly 3 projects. The 2 that Anne just introduced, Resiste and UNICEF, but also from a project that's funded by the Swedish Research Council called Violence Regimes. And I will use the evidence from these 3 projects to make no less than 10 interventions into the theorizing of gender-based violence, underlining the importance of a feminist and gender plus framework in the analysis of violence. And then I will dig a bit deeper into gender-based violence in the world of work, in particular in academia, drawing on UNICEF. And I will use the UNICEF data to demonstrate how prevalent gender-based violence is across RPOs in Europe, research performing organizations. And based on some of these findings, I will also say something about the organizational context of violence. Those of you who have heard me talk about violence before will have heard exactly this phrase, but I'm going to repeat it. Gender-based violence is pervasive, persistent, and a highly prevalent global problem connected to crime, capital, health, finance, power, and other hegemons. It is an extreme expression of gender inequality and a simultaneous cause and consequence of gender inequality and an inequality in itself. In line with international conventions, it's a human rights violation. We know this. It has serious detrimental effects, sometimes deadly effects on people. It can include physical, sexual, economic, and psychological forms of violence and violations, and in online and offline contexts. And we've seen throughout our research new emerging forms of online violence throughout COVID, and new forms of technology-facilitated violence throughout COVID. But gender-based violence is part of a bigger system. It is a system of dominance and of power inequalities, which go beyond a binary understanding of gender, and it reaches beyond legalistic, narrow legalistic, or judicial definitions of violence. So we have forms of violence that are criminalized, but that doesn't mean that that's the only form of violence that exists. Following this understanding of violence, this framing of violence, gender-based violence is related to power, but not reducible to power. It's not the same thing. And working across these European projects, it's becoming very clear that there are certainly different understandings of violence, different definitions of violence, of gender-based violence and of gender itself. So depending on whether gender-based violence is understood as a feminist problem, an organizational problem, a psychological problem, a criminological problem, and so on, it means different things. We know this. Gender, in turn, is even more complex. It always intersects with other inequality grounds. They mutually shape each other. They overlap sometimes and sometimes not. There's nothing that is just gender. Gender does not exist as a pure category. It is always mutually shaped by other inequality grounds. We refer to this as gender plus in our research. And gender is also a social construct. It's a hierarchy, it's a process. It's not just a variable, a mere variable where you count women and men and non-binary people. It does something more than that. Well, it is something more than that. So my 10 interventions into the theory of violence, and you will be looking at the screen for quite some time because I will go through them a bit more in detail. So first of all, gender-based violence is a cause and consequence of gender inequalities and an inequality in its own right. The cause and consequence, I think, is a relatively sort of easy concept to grasp, but it causes gender-based violence causes inequalities, and inequalities cause gender-based violence. But the understanding of gender-based violence as an inequality in its own right is slightly more complex. It's a change in the perspective from seeing violence as always caused by something else to one in which the practice of violence in itself is a form of social inequality, an unequal and unequalizing social structure, division, and relation of its own. And to quote my colleague Jeff Hearn, who also works in violence regimes and UNICEF, violence is not always simply a subset of some other social division. Violence is a social distribution of who does what to whom. Violence distinguishes people individually and structurally. So violence in itself separates and segregates people. This type of argument can be supported with empirical evidence showing that violence can operate somewhat independently from other inequality regimes. So, for example, we have situations where the levels of gender-based violence or violence against women is really high, but that coexist with high levels of economic equality, high levels of health equality, high levels of, or low level of a gender pay gap. So the violence somehow seems to have its own life and its own inequality, rather than being just following on these other domains of inequalities. Second, gender-based violence is autotelic. That means that violence causes violence. This is an argument from Schinkel from 2010 and 2013. It also means that previous violence, being exposed to it and having experienced it or perpetrated it, is a predictor of subsequent violence, rather than being only an expression of other inequalities. So violence can certainly be a means to some other end, but it can also be an end in itself. That's what autotelic means, violence for its own sake, rather than heterotelic, violence for the sake of something else. The autotelic nature of violence is related to the notion of the system of violence, point 3 on my list of 10 points. In the thinking of violence as a system, it means that different forms of violence correlate, so that changes in one form of violence co-varies with changes in other forms of violence to create a form of interrelated system of violence. So violence or gender-based violence can be usefully understood as a system, including perpetration, victimhood, survivorhood, responses, policies, practices, rather than as isolated individual incidents. So conceptualizing violence as a system is important because it means dismissing narratives that describe gender-based violence as isolated and individual. It lifts violence from the micro level to the meso, to the macro, and it looks at how these forms of violence relate. Four, gender-based violence is an expression of power and dominance, rather than an expression of the relative loss of power or individual marginalization. This flips the conventional understanding of the direction of violence, where we quite often in, say, conventional criminology or psychology or sociology, think of violence as being perpetrated by those with relatively less power. It is the marginalized, the dysfunctional families, the working class poor, the socially excluded, that somehow are seen as violent. Here, in this understanding, we flip this around. And we say that violence is perpetrated by those who are relatively privileged towards those who are relatively less privileged. This is, I think, a quite classic feminist understanding of violence. If you look at the gender regime, violence is perpetrated by men towards women, by men towards non-binary people, by the powerful towards the less powerful. So maybe for us in this room, this is not shocking, but in some conventional studies, this completely flips it around. Fifth, gender-based violence is a form of structural oppression reflecting power relations in society as a whole, meaning that women, marginalized groups, and minorities who are generally subordinated in one sense, or in many senses, marginalized, are the expected victims of violence. So while recognizing that there's certainly no symmetry in the experiences of gender-based violence, which some studies seem to argue, we see that gender relations stem from gender inequalities in power. At the same time, we must acknowledge the experiences of violence of men and further genders, in addition to violence against women. So this includes what Anne mentioned before, that in relation to diverse and often marginalized gender identities and sexualities, those summarized under the umbrella LGBTQI+. Now this obviously raises the question of, do we include men-men violence, women-women violence, or indeed woman-man violence? Or can that be excluded from gender-based violence? Let's see in our discussion later. From what we see in the research projects that I quoted earlier, and that Anne also mentioned, any and all violence include gender. There are always multiple notions and experiences of violence set in continuous motion, even within a single subject's narratives or single subject's bodies. Specifically, the issue of whether there is a gender or a sexual element in all forms of violence is obviously partly an empirical question that we can examine. We can ask the question to our data. But it also depends on what theoretical analytical framework you use. So coming from a gender regimes framework, where you see power and gender inequalities in the relation of violence, I see violence is always related to gender, it's gender coded, it's gender embedded, it's gendered. But if there's a difference between gender coded, gender embedded, and gender based, I don't know. So feminist epistemology, seeing violence. By this I mean that violence, violations, abuse, and their consequences need to be seen from the experiences of the survivor victim. This means that the focus is on seeing gender-based violence and its consequences, rather than focusing exclusively on its causes. So in this, looking at the experiences and the victim-survivor side of violence, it extends the understanding of gender-based violence to include acts and events that may not be regarded as violence yet, because they are experienced violence and they have the effects that violence have. And I think in the work that we've done collaboratively in Resistri and UNICEF, this has been really crucial to focus on the experiences of gender-based violence. 8. The importance of involving not only victims and survivors, perpetrators, but also bystanders in the analysis of violence. Not because we want to remove the focus from the victim survivor, this is still the core, but because bystanders have a role in preventing violence. They should be seen as knowledgeable subjects who also may be held accountable for being arguably complicit in the violence that they are standing by, watching, seeing, hearing. Nine, the continuum of violence. So gender-based violence, as I think that I started by saying, is a persistent feature and force, and is often unspoken in organizations and the world of work, including in research performing organizations. And it operates on a continuum of violence. This concept is used to describe how violence and violations, violent behaviors and attitudes are based on gender, but how they sort of not overlap, but how one form is connected to another form, connected to another form. So it's very difficult to separate them, to say that this is that form of violence, this is that form of violence, this is this form of violence. And this creates a problem for our empirical analysis. How do we measure experiences of different forms of violence if they're all interrelated? How do we separate them? And what does it do when we separate them? What does it do for a feminist understanding of the holistic experience of violence? So this, I think, raises a major problem for empirical measurement. And then 10, in theorizing gender-based violence, the question of intersectionality is central. That is the interconnected and complex ways that multiple inequalities, gender, age, ethnicity, class, disability, you know the Butlerian, etc., how they relate, and how in empirical measurements and empirical studies we tend to separate them again, because we want to have the gender, we want to have the age category, we want to have the LGBT category. So to me, there's this gap between the theoretical understanding of violence that I think is a solid one, and when we collect data on multiple forms of violence. So given these sort of theoretical lessons, interventions, or roadmap, I would say that academia is certainly an ideal place for violence. It has all the distinct organizational features which worsen the problem of gender-based violence within universities and other research organizations, including gendered and hierarchical structures relying on authority and power inequalities, gender unequal cultures. It operates as its own separate domain, somehow its own separate world of work. It is based on neoliberal cultures with unhealthy competition for, well, you know this, for grants, for publications, for visibility. There's a high reliance on precarious employment, short-term contracts, mobile people who come and go, stay for a couple of years, couple of months, and then they're out, lacking support networks. So organizations and research organizations, universities and research organizations have distinct structures with hierarchies and power that make them the ultimate place, let's say, for gender-based violence. So the structural inequalities and the elitism can increase the problem of gender-based violence. The very culture of research and higher education is characterized by asymmetric power relations, hierarchical structures, and strong dependence on senior staff. Some say that there's signs of, well, many have experienced maybe, signs of toxic masculinity as seen as tendencies towards hyper-competition and extreme individualism. All of these reinforces inequalities and hierarchies of power that are structured by gender and age, whiteness, nationality, and which underpin violence. So given this understanding of violence, given academia as the sort of blueprint for gender-based violence in academia or at work at large have often fallen outside the research interest, the mainstream research interest on violence, which Anne also mentioned in her introduction. So instead, gender-based violence has predominantly been explored in the home, either as violence against women or as different forms of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And looking at some Eurobarometer data from 2016, this is reflected in the perception of people of where violence happens. So the majority of the people surveyed report that 86% report that violence against women is likely to occur at home. 19% says that it's likely to believe that it's likely to occur in public spaces. 19% online, 17% at the workplace, 8% in public transport, and specifically in schools or universities, only 5% thought that it was likely to happen in academia and in schools. So one of the aims of UNICEF was therefore to provide reliable and comparable data on different forms of gender-based violence in academia to understand the extent of the problem amongst both staff and students. We did a mapping to obtain a baseline of gender-based violence in the countries included in the UNICEF project. And the mapping was led by Marcela Linkova at ISIS in Prague, and it showed that national prevalence studies on gender-based violence in RPOs, research performing organizations, are very few. They cover only a few countries. A majority did not have any such study at all. A few countries, Sweden, Serbia, Slovenia, had implemented some studies, prevalence studies in 2021, 2022. Canada, the Czech Republic, Estonia, and Ireland have done it previously. Few of the prevalence studies included both staff and students. Most of them address victims, not perpetrators or bystanders. They're limited in scope. They cover sexual harassment and sexual violence. And they look at, when it's sexual harassment, they look at staff sexual harassment. And when they looked at sexual violence, they looked at student-student relations. So turning to the UNICEF survey to see if we could deliver some reliable data on this. It was implemented in 46 RPOs in 15 countries in 14 languages in 2022. I can't remember how many months the survey was running, a few months. And it generated 42,000 responses. The sample was 67% who identified as women, 30% identified as men, and 3% identified as non-binary. And in total, it was 43% staff and 56% students. And a shocking number, 62%, reported having experienced any form of gender-based violence in academia since they started working at the institution. This is largely due to the high level of psychological violence, and 57%. But we also have 31% reporting sexual harassment, 10% reporting economic violence, 8% reporting online violence, 6% physical violence, and 3% sexual violence. If we look at the different target groups, so which groups report how much violence, we see that the numbers are significantly higher for non-binary people. Well, they're not significant, they're higher for non-binary people than for those who identify as women or for those who identify as men. We see that they're higher if you have a disability. They are higher if you're staff and student. But they are, for all of these groups, shockingly high. And another thing that I think that Anne is very good to point out is that even if it looks at just 3% of non-binary people, that's 1,200 people, if I remember correctly, who report this. 1,121. So looking at the consequences of violence, we see a similar pattern with there we go. Looking at the consequences on well-being for staff, the purple line shows that those who have experienced gender-based violence, what are the effects on their well-being? And the green line is those that have not experienced gender-based violence. What are their effects? How do they report on health and well-being? And it's consistently higher in terms of negative effects on well-being for those who have experienced gender-based violence than those who have not experienced gender-based violence. No matter which one of the different questions we asked, it was constantly higher for those who had experienced gender-based violence, except for the none of the above. That was obviously higher for. So if you've experienced gender-based violence, 34% of those had taken time off work or had to stay off work. 54% had experienced reduced work productivity compared to 32% of those who had not experienced gender-based violence. 33% of those who experienced gender-based violence had tried to change their team, their unit, the department, the supervisor, whereas only 9% of others had tried to make these sort of changes for whatever reason. If you've experienced gender-based violence, you're more likely to have changed or tried to change your institution, you have considered leaving the academic sector, and you feel dissatisfied with your job. Same thing when you look at work-related consequences. Sorry, that's the same. I've lost what this one should say was health and well-being. So we asked questions about direct consequences for people's health And we see the same pattern as for the work-related consequences. All the negative consequences are much higher for those who have experienced gender-based violence compared to those who had not. And then this is the slide coming from the report that we did in UNICEF, a report that was led by Anne here. So what I want to say here is that to get back to the pervasive and ubiquitous nature of gender-based violence, and the argument that the research environment, the university, is a unique culture and a blueprint for gender-based violence, that violence is autotelic and that it operates as a system and as an inequality in itself, in addition to both causing and being caused by other inequalities. The analysis in UNICEF combined the different strands of evidence collected in form of a mapping of national and organizational policies on gender-based violence, a Europe-wide survey on gender-based violence and its consequences, in-depth interviews with people that have experienced or witnessed gender-based violence in the context of the institution, and case studies on institutional responses to gender-based violence. These 4 different studies were led by ICES in Prague, GESIS in Cologne, LSTC in Vilnius, and DUCM in Madrid. The results of this analysis shows that the prevalence of gender-based violence is relatively uniform across countries and across RPOs. The variance is low between RPOs, suggests that the prevalence of gender-based violence is largely unrelated to the RPO itself, i.e. to the RPO where the respondent worked. We see no significant differences. If you work in academia, you are highly likely to have exposed gender-based violence, regardless of what the country is or the RPO. So the conclusion from this is that gender-based violence is not a problem for individual RPOs. It's a problem for the entire world of work and for the entire European research area. So to conclude, addressing gender-based violence in universities and research organizations is crucial, for one, but talking is obviously not enough, and policies in themselves do not protect us. We see this because the levels are similar across the RPOs, even though the national policies are different and the organizational policies are different. So what we in UNICEF want to argue is that the development and policies and practices to counter violence need to work towards violent-free organizations and workplaces. It means fostering and furthering violence-free institutions. It means violence-free processes and actions within them, and most obviously, violence-free cultures, ways of working or studying at all levels and all forms of management and control. And we need to understand that violence-free cultures or institutions is not only about the absence of physical or other forms of direct and indirect violence. It's also about the existence of what has been called positive peace. You know, with the sense and the feelings and the actions of positive inclusion, safety, and a safe space. This is not rocket science. This is from a book in 2001. So sadly, what we still need to do was told us 22 years ago by Jeff Hearn and Wendy Parkin. Specific practices and examples include many schools based on principles of no violence, so-called peace education approaches to work, and work on safe spaces. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sofia. So what we'd like to do now is maybe invite you both to come in front of this so we can just have a little bit of a discussion. Can we stop the recording?